Hi again, this is Dr. Jessica Wright, and I am very pleased to bring you the second part in our three-part series on understanding grief. And so in this video, what we're going to be doing is talking through the job that grief gives you, the work of doing grief. In our first video, we talked about grieving other types of losses, so things that are not a death. And we talked about abstract losses and concrete losses. And in our last video that will come after this one, the third video, we'll talk about grief rituals and the importance of rituals in helping us to grieve. So let's get started. When I talk about the job of grief, I mean, what is the purpose of the grieving and what is it that it's moving us towards? So like a brick wall being built, little by little, what is the purpose of each of the moments of grief that we are experiencing, and what is it moving towards? And so that's what we're going to talk about. So the job of grief is actually 3 steps. So 3 different steps for the job of grief. First, grief makes you slow down. Second, grief makes you observe what is lost. And third, grief makes you recalibrate what it's going to mean to live without the thing that you lost. The first thing, slow down. When you experience grief, when you experience a loss, you are being forced to slow down. Whether you want to or not, it's sort of beyond your capacity. The sadness that you feel is actually causing you to slow down, causing your life to slow down, causing your world to slow down or to stop, so that your mind can do the second step, which is observe what is lost. And you'll notice, I'll bring this up again when we talk about rituals, but when someone dies and we go to a funeral, that funeral is not scheduled around the convenience of everyone else's life. That funeral is scheduled according to what is needed to do to mark the event of that person passing. And so a lot of times we'll have to take off work, we'll have to drive or fly to another place. The rituals around grief often help us to slow down. And so, again, when we've lost something, it's really important that we slow down so that we can then observe and identify what is lost. The homework for last time was for you to make a list of things that you have lost over the past few months so that you can acknowledge them, right? We talked about how if you do not acknowledge them, then that pain that you might be feeling can turn into suffering, which is pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. And that suffering is what we want to do. One thing to note is when you're talking about those abstract losses, one of the things that Dr. Susan Bernstone said was that when you're talking about abstract losses, it's not really clear what action you need to take in order to make your life feel whole again. So if someone has passed away, there are different actions that you could take in order to, process the loss and make your life feel whole again. But when you're talking about a loss of the prediction of the future, for example, or certainty, or a loss of security, it's not as obvious what actions need to take. But one of the things that Dr. Bernstone wrote about in her work was that journaling or talking through things is going to be the best action to take, so that you can find very specific things that are tailored to your individual situation. We talked about last time how loss is individual. And to me, the loss of a commute might be very important. We'd use that as an example, right? The commute to work might be a really important time to me, and losing it might mean something more to me than it does to you. So that means the solution, right, to, observing the loss of my commute is going to look very different for me than it would to you. And so the recommendation is to journal, to write, to make that loss inventory, to talk it out with someone else. So we've got these 3 steps. First, grief, the exquisite sadness that you feel, the very intense, acute sadness that you feel when you have a loss, causes you to slow down. and it causes you to reflect back on what is lost. And then, like I said, that third step is for your brain to recalibrate what life means without the thing that you have lost. So one of the more interesting components with the research for this series was looking at how your brain works. And so this is kind of like your brain on grief. If you'll remember those commercials from the, 80s, 90s, this is your brain on drugs. Well, this is your brain on grief. So one of the things that your brain does on a regular basis, not just for grief, but for lots of other things, is we are constantly looking for patterns. If you've looked at, if you come to any of our science of learning classes, you'll know we talk a lot about how humans were not the strongest animal in the jungle, but we were the best at problem solving. And part of what we're really good at and what we've evolved to be incredibly fine-tuned at doing is finding patterns. Finding patterns to help us to predict the future. So, for example, if I notice that at a particular time a predator is in the jungle at this particular spot, I can identify that as a pattern, predict that the predator is going to be back there another time, and I will avoid the situation. So that's sort of the evolutionary reasoning behind why we're so good at finding patterns and predicting the future. But this has been a huge part to our advantage. And one of the key things that we do when we grieve is that our brain, which is like an association engine, it's always trying to find other things associated to things that we're thinking about. So if there's a particular song that you liked in high school, when you hear that song, you might also associate it with, there's a particular song that when I hear it, I can think about when I was 15 and my sister was 16, and we would drive in her car in the summertime with the top pulled down. She had like a soft top to her car. It was a very loud car going by. I don't know if that's getting recorded in the video, but right. And I have a particular memory, right, of driving to school, listening to this thing. That's an association engine that I have. So one of the things that happens when we've lost something and we are grieving, our brain is trying to find out what are all the different associations to this thing that we've lost or to this person that we've lost, and try to predict what the future is going to look like without them. And obviously, the closer that person is, if it's a person who has been lost, the closer that person who is to you, the harder the grief is, because the harder it is to see what life is going to be like in the future. So let me give you an example. If every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. for the past 5 years, you have had coffee with a colleague, and you sit and you talk with this colleague, and this is a special time that you carve out in your schedule. Once a week, you sit and you have coffee with your colleague. If that person dies, then the loss that you experience is going to cause your brain to think about all the patterns associated with that ritual that you had with the person and try to predict what will happen on Tuesday at 10 a.m. now. What's going to happen, and what is the point of coffee, and what does the world look like without that ritual, without that person, without the meaning that coffee time gave to you? And so one of the quotes that I want to share, so some of the good research on this is done by Dr. George Bonanno, who we quoted in the first video that we did on grief called the grief etiquette. I couldn't remember for a second. Grief etiquette. So, and Dr. Bonanno is a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia, and he's done a lot of work on bereavement. And so he talks about how when we're really attached to someone, the attachment is part of our identity. So our brain is geared toward predicting the interactions with that person and relying on those interactions. So even though we're not necessarily in that person's presence, they're sort of always a part of us, always in our mind. And then when someone dies, or if you break up with that person after a significant relationship, our brain has the task of recalibrating the rest of the world and the meaning that we have without that person. So even though that person is no longer physically in the world, they're still in our head, says Dr. Bonanno. We carry a mental representation of the person as part of our cognitive currency. Your brain has to recalibrate what it means to never see the person again without completely erasing the image within. So to hold on to that person and hold on to who that person has been with you without erasing them completely. And so, the trick is, going out through the world and then seeing something that that person would like, or something that that person talked to you about over coffee. If we go back to the example of the colleague that's drinking coffee with you, I just saw something that that person would love, or, oh, I can't wait to tell that person next Tuesday about this thing. And those things will continuously pop up in your mind until over time, and each time those things pop up, they cause exquisite sadness to occur because you're grieving the loss of that happening. Until over time, those things can be brought up, and we've created the neural connections, the neural pathways to say, yes, this is something that person would love. Yes, that person's gone. And also, I understand how the world now works without them. And so that's how, that third part is what comes eventually after you go through, oh, there's something that person would love. Oh, I wish I could tell them. Extreme sadness. Oh, there's something that person would love. I can't wait to tell them. Sadness. Oh, there's something else, this song that reminds me of that person. Sadness. And then eventually, after sadness will come the memory of the person associated with the sadness without the extreme pain of early grief. So that's some of the work that Dr. George Bonanno has done. So I think it's important to reflect on, when have you done this before? When have you grieved a loss in the past where, it has been painful, that loss has been painful, and then over time you've been able to remember that person, remember that thing with fondness, instead of with the pain. And the reason we reflect on when have you done this before is because sometimes when we're in the middle of grief, when we're in the pain, we're in the early part where all we feel is the sadness, it's hard for us to realize that we're going to get out of it, that we're going to move beyond it, that things are going to be, we are not always going to be in the pain. And so if you spend some time reflecting on how you've done this job before, where you've been in the pain, you've acknowledged all the different things that you've lost, and then you've realized, okay, this is what the world now looks like without this thing that I've lost, and done that third part so that you're able to reflect on that person or think about the thing you lost without the pain. If we can think about doing it in the past, what we've done before, it helps us to know that we can do it again, so that if we experience a loss, that it will take time, but that the pain will not last forever. And I think that's really, really important. And so I encourage you to consider that and to think about that. In our last video in this series, we are going to be talking about the grief rituals, the rituals of grief, and what is the benefit, some of the amazing benefits of the rituals that we have around loss and grief. All right, I look forward to talking to you then. Bye.